A year ago this month, when Victoria and I were moving to Arlington, so was the Statue of Liberty, or at least a new and well-known version of it named Reclining Liberty. When I watched news reports about the sculpture's arrival, I immediately resonated with it, a 25-foot horizontal version of the same Lady Liberty that for over a century has greeted immigrants seeking political freedom. This podcast episode draws from my Arlington Tech students' exclusive interview with Zaq Landsberg, the sculptor of Reclining Liberty, about the nature and possibilities of art in public spaces. I'm Bryce Tolbin. Packing up in the exurbs, I took Reclining Liberty's move to Arlington as a sign. Victoria and I would be examining public life in our new town, and Reclining Liberty would be here too. It would be a conversation starter about the nature and future of freedom in America. Reclining Liberty spent her first year in Harlem, her second in Liberty State Park opposite Ellis Island and the original Statue of Liberty. She came down I-95 from the greater New York City area stretched out on a flatbed, with her green crowned head elevated a bit by resting it in her right hand. D.C. area TV news shows and newspapers covered her evening tour around the National Mall.
The team that helped him install it, I think, has a flair for the dramatic, so I expected that they would have at least wrapped it up, but they had just brought it down on the highway completely unwrapped. I think they liked the spectacle of it. There's some footage they took of it going around the mall, like in front of the Capitol building. That's
Blair Murphy, the curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art Arlington, where Reclining Liberty now lies and will for the next year. Murphy was talking to my Arlington Tech students who took a field trip to Reclining Liberty as part of our unit on remixes.
They drove it down at night, so like 10 o'clock at night, and I looked at it and I was like, you don't actually need to go through there to get to Virginia from New York. I think they just wanted that footage of it like rolling down the National, rolling down Constitution Avenue by the National Mall.
Landsberg connected right away with my students, who before the Zoom interview with Landsberg at his busy studio had already been connecting with the playful and anti-authoritarian vibe of Landsberg's work.
I feel like my persona, my character, is to do absurd stuff with a really dead serious face. I feel pretty fortunate that the interpretations that I know about, or people who don't like it, it's still sort of in the zone. Somebody wrote a letter to the Arlington Public Arts, and I think used the words middle school jackassery to describe the Reclining Liberty, which is actually not that far off with kind of my coming at things sideways and being playful and being kind of a little bit snide with what I'm doing.
Landsberg accepts this critique of middle school jackassery as one way into understanding his art. His Instagram site says he specializes in, quote, site-specific large-scale sculpture. I make things that look like other things, close quote. Some of those other things critique those things. He made a statue of Christopher Columbus that looks much like the famous statue of the Italian explorer that stands on New York City's Columbus Circle. The original statue was put up by 19th century Italian immigrants to the U.S., but Columbus's reputation has deteriorated since then because of his actions as an enslaver of thousands of indigenous people. How to celebrate Italian heritage and critique Columbus at the same time? Landsberg threads this needle by making his Columbus statue out of a kind of fungus that will deteriorate over time, eventually transforming the statue into mushrooms.
Historically, he's a really bad guy. Even the Spanish, they removed him from governor because he was too brutal. I think as a society, we don't need this, right? So I think the conversation is, a false dichotomy, maybe, right? So it's keep it up or take it down, right? So I think if you are Italian American, there are other Italian Americans that you could replace Columbus with, right? It doesn't have to be that historical figure. As a maker of objects and monuments and statues, this idea of taking things down, or that there's a zero-sum game, there can only be one thing, the town square, I think that's also false. I don't know, they could commission me to make something that riffs on it, right? That you could have two things next to each other. I think the answer is more stuff.
Landsberg's impulse is not to tear down objectionable statues, but to erect other statues near them that critique the originals. The juxtaposition would generate a kind of conversation over time, a conversation perhaps between power and people, a critique of the entire concept of sovereignty, of the claim of one person or one group or class or race to rule over others. This ongoing conversation would broaden public space. One of Landsberg's ideas that I think plays to this is something he hasn't built yet, a statue of the Iraqi people tearing down a statue.
What was one remix that you have always wanted to do but never had the time or the supplies for?
I really, really wanted to make a monument to the Saddam monument getting pulled down. It's Verdo Square. I mean, you guys might be a little young for this, but like in 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, there was this like constant CNN footage of that statue the statue of Saddam getting toppled over and over and over. And I think it would make a good monument to that conflict and to that war, to make a monument of the statue getting toppled down, capture this like camera footage that we saw like over and over and over and over.
Whether it's a statue of Columbus or a statue of Saddam Hussein, Landsberg often creates remixes. Reclining Liberty can be understood as a remix, offering perhaps a more accessible symbol of liberty than even the original statue, particularly for those whose ancestors didn't come to America through Ellis Island.
The original Statue of Liberty is in New York Harbor. It's a crop from essentially like downtown Manhattan, the like financial center of the world, and kind of port. There's these a lot of people, including some of my relatives on one side of my family, has this like Ellis Island immigration story, and most people in Harlem do not have that. Their relationship to immigration, to this symbol, to the country, is more complicated and more nuanced. And so that was kind of the initial core, or kernel of the idea of like, okay, can I riff on this monument and in a way that speaks to this community, and that sort of twists it or reflects this thing that like not all Americans have the same relationship with this symbol, and kind of all the history that comes with it.
My Arlington Tech students were conceptualizing and writing about their own remixes that critiqued different aspects of Arlington public life. In teams of 2 or 3, they would later turn those remixes into 3-dimensional expressions. But you can hear the grinders in the background as Landsberg's team races to meet a deadline for another sculpture. So what makes a good remix?
Yeah, a remix should be more than a sum of its parts, right? So if you're smushing 2 things together, or whatever you're doing to the thing, it should be better than both of those things, right? Did you guys listen to the Grey album? It's a remix of like the Beatles' White album and Jay-Z's Black album, right? And so like it's not just those 2 seminal albums together. To like smushing them together creates something new and weird. I think the remix doesn't need to be like a critique necessarily, but it does need to say something different, right? Or reveal something, a different side of, a different facet of the original or originals.
Landsberg's first 3D art project was a remix, and he and a buddy created it in high school.
I feel like I've always been drawing ever since I was a little kid. Like I've always had kind of a marker in my hand or what have you. But I went to a high school that was kind of like a hippie school, and there was a couple buildings in LA that like were in a kind of commercial area, and to do PE we had to take the bus to the park because there was no grass on campus. And I mean, that was kind of the appeal of it, but it was sort of a joke. And so a friend and I made like a planter box. We bought a piece of sod and it was like 1.5 by 1.5 and we put wheels on it, and we did this like unveiling, little square of grass, and then a keep off grass sign, and then it could be rolled around campus. So we would just roll this thing around campus, and then everybody would like look at the grass, and it kind of died and it kind of became sad. But that was sort of a turn where I was like drawing figures and things and comic books to like making an object, putting it in context, putting it in a place, and kind of riffing. So that was a turn, like a kind of proto work that do now.
And like with your drawings, was it something you wanted to just turn into sculptures, or was that things you just thought would be cool, like you like to construct things and that just turned into making sculptures?
Really, I went to college and I took a sculpture class for the first time, and the third dimension really changed things. Like you and I and we are three-dimensional objects that occupy physical space in a way that drawings and 2D stuff does not. So when you make anything that's about 6 feet tall and about 1.5, 2 feet wide, the human body reacts to it as an object, a person, something to, and so that I found like extremely compelling, and still do, that this idea of objects in space has not just an intellectual effect on you, but a physical effect on your body.
Sometimes it gets maybe too real. Some people are in a place where they're ready to take the remix for the real thing. This happened when Landsberg won some land in Utah in 2005 on an eBay auction and declared it to be a sovereign nation, Zakistan. Zakistan has a monument, a port of entry, a victory arch, and in downtown Salt Lake City, there's even a tourism office. Zakistan offers a reflection on nationalism and on the modern nation state. But Landsberg felt terrible when some people overseas contacted him looking for asylum.
If I make things and people don't get it, and kind of basically Zakistan went that way, that's bad. There was a local news report that went viral about Zakistan, and it went all over the world. And for, I don't know, a couple weeks, I was getting literally dozens, if not hundreds, of emails from Pakistanis who wanted to immigrate to Zakistan, who wanted to move their families and small businesses there. They were sending me like scans of their passports and resumes and stuff. It was pretty dark because, I mean, they do, what the circumstances that they're living in Pakistan or their lives, they don't want to be, their station in life is not good. But also, like, I couldn't come up with the words to communicate to them what Zakistan is, and so that became kind of dark and kind of a, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like a bummer of just like, I don't know how to explain to these people like what what this patch of nothing in the desert is, and that I don't know, I kind of intentionally or unintentionally created this hope space that I think whose existence is, I think, kind of important, but also not important enough to confuse these people.
Context helps, and it's hard to put Landsberg's work in context with just the internet. Landsberg's art is site-specific. It's in conversation with the public space it creates. In grappling with his work, even moving from the internet to a museum wouldn't make that much difference. If Landsberg's work were in a museum, visitors there would only experience something like one end of a telephone conversation.
There are kind of conceptual artists and land artists in the late 60s, early 70s. So Robert Smithson and then Gordon Matta Clark. They kind of had this idea of like the art, it doesn't belong in a white cube, right, in a gallery. And we're going to go outside and put something in the desert, or so like Robert Smithson's Lateral Jetty, I think, is an amazing art piece. If you guys ever get the chance to see that in Utah, it's pretty mind blowing. I feel like I'm influenced by those guys. This toolkit of this idea that the art doesn't stop at the edges of the canvas, and it doesn't stop on the pedestal. That the relationship of the art to the grass, to the place it's in, to the context, to the history, that's really important.
When we were interviewing Landsberg this past school year, Arlington Cemetery, less than a mile from our school, was in the process of removing its Confederate memorial. I had the memorial in mind when I asked Landsberg about how a community relates to its statues.
Why do communities, do you think, become so attached to statues, particularly ones in public places such as parks, squares, and courthouses? Do you think communities will do that with your art, or do your works kind of critique that practice in some way to look so highly at these permanent statues that they hope will last forever?
I actually don't think communities are attached to statues. I think there are actually very few. I mean, I think the Lincoln Memorial is something that people, really relate to. But I would say, like, definitely in New York City, like, you'd be hard pressed to stop somebody on the street and have them tell you which statue is which and who is where, right? I mean, one, humans like to look at other humans, right? The figurative is important, but I think a lot of the bronze monuments, particularly in Virginia and down south, are political. They're there for a reason. They're put up by a particular group of people trying to show that they were in charge and trying to get a very particular message across. And so I think when we're talking about statuary, when we're talking about monuments and controversy, we're not talking about art in a vacuum. We're talking about art as a tool to intimidate or to impose an ideology. And so in that sense, people are very tied to that ideology or those politics or that way society is structured. So I mean, I hope my work disrupts that a little bit, or sort of is able to shake people out of that a little bit, and maybe make something that this idea of public sculpture is maybe a little more participatory, maybe a little more approachable, and maybe a little more like small d democratic.
Thank you, Mr. Landsberg. Appreciate it. Yeah. Bye-bye. Well done, you guys. Well done.
Thank you for listening to Public Spaces. Join us next time to hear about an Arlington church that sold its building below market value to make way for low-income housing. The church's people now meet in the new apartment building and live their lives more and more with its residents. How did the church get from pews and steeple to a more public-oriented form of worship and service? Until then.